Welcome back. So now we've talked about the law of demand, we've talked about the law of supply, we've talked about shifting them, and now it's time to put them all together. So if on the same graph we put together the demand curve and the supply curve, demand curve and the supply curve, right, we see that they cross, and of course in graphs whenever things cross that's often important, and it's at that point right there where they cross that we have equilibrium. And equilibrium is the point, it's the price at which, I guess, the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. Remember, the demand curve tells you the quantity demanded over a whole range of prices, right, all the way from up here all the way down to here. So over a whole range of prices there are various quantity demandeds, and then over the whole supply curve, right, that's made up of the quantity supplied over a whole range of prices. And right here at what we call the equilibrium price, right, P sub E, the equilibrium price, at that point the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. So we label this the equilibrium quantity and this the equilibrium price, and this point we refer to as equilibrium. I wrote it out. Often you'll just see it labeled with an E. And that's going to be a very important graph. So when the demand curve and the supply curve are steady and they're at a particular point, where they cross is what we call the equilibrium price. Now, what does that mean? And what happens if the price moves away from that, right? We predict that that is the market clearing price. But really, what do we mean by that? Well, let's label this here. Here's a demand curve. Here's a supply curve. Here's the point of equilibrium. And so here is the equilibrium price. And here is the equilibrium quantity. Now, what if a seller chooses to sell at a price that's higher than P sub E? So I'm going to call this P sub H for the high price. Let me write it a little neater. There we go. What if you try to sell at the high price? That's P sub H. Notice what happens. At P sub H, there is a quantity demanded, right? The demand curve tells us the quantity demanded at a whole range of prices. We have a particular price in mind, that's P sub H. And at that P sub H, you can look at the demand curve and you can find the quantity demanded, right, at P sub H, so at the high price. Now, is that the same as the quantity supplied? No, right? At P sub H, you look at the supply curve, and that tells you the quantity supplied at the high price, right? Because the supply curve tells you the quantity supplied at a whole range of prices. You have a particular price in mind. You look there. Are they the same? No, right? Quantity demanded is not equal to the quantity supplied, right? And so when the quantity supplied is larger, you actually have extra stuff around, right? There's more units for sale than people want to buy, and so that is what we call a surplus, right? Because the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. Now, what happens in stores, in the real world, when there's extra inventory, when there's a surplus, when there are units that people aren't going to buy? Eventually, they tend to get discounted, right? When there's a surplus, that tends to put downward pressure on price. So, okay. Now, let's think about another scenario. Let's pick a lower price. Well, and, because I'm not that creative, I'll call that P sub L for a lower price. And at P sub L, let's look for the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. Here, to find the quantity demanded, I look at the demand curve. So here is the quantity demanded at the low price. But at this lower price, how many units do producers want to make and sell? Well, the quantity supplied at the low price is much smaller. And so at P sub L, there are only this many units for sale, but consumers want to buy that many units, and so there's this difference right here. And what do we call this difference? Well, when the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied, we have a shortage. right? So when the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied, we have a shortage. And what tends to happen to price when there's a shortage? Well, people start bidding it up, right? And the price starts moving up. And we could do intermediate steps, and you could say, well, let's pick a different price, right in here where there's still a shortage, but it's not quite as big, right, as it was before. Whoops, got a little bit out of hand with my erasing. Hold on, let me fix that. That was blue, wasn't it? Yeah. There we go. And so what happens? Whenever the price is lower than the equilibrium price, there's a shortage, and that puts upward pressure on price. When there is when the price is higher than equilibrium, there is a surplus, and there tends to be downward pressure on price. And where do they end up? Right? Everything is pushing in the direction of this equilibrium. And so the equilibrium we refer to as the market clearing price, right? Because it's at that point where the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. So there's a natural tendency for price to move to equilibrium, or at least in the direction of equilibrium. And that's not something new. That's something that Adam Smith famously discussed. And he said that it's as if prices are guided by an invisible hand. So here's a little vocabulary in this, right? Equilibrium we talked about, right? The place where quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. The intersection we talked about a surplus and a shortage when the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied are not equal. Invisible hand is Smith's language, and in that he says that prices tend to move toward equilibrium as if guided by an invisible hand. Did a lot of research in a lot of old archives, and I found a picture of an invisible hand. There it is. All right, sorry, that's all I got. Thoughts or questions? You'll have to raise them via email or in office hours. Now, that's when supply and demand are steady, but what happens when any of those many factors that we talked about occur? Well, then that can cause supply or demand to change, and then that will lead to a new equilibrium. And so this is pretty straightforward, but let's just work a couple examples, and then you can work some examples on your own. So we'll talk about a particular market. Let's make this the market for golf shirts. There's some equilibrium. And the market clears at this point, but then what happens if other things in the world change? So what if golf gets more popular, right? What if all of a sudden a lot of people start golfing, golf gets very popular, and people are buying more clothes for golfing? Well, that would cause which curve to shift? Probably the demand. In which direction? Probably an increase, right? And remember, an increase in demand is a rightward shift. Don't think up or down. Always think rightward or leftward, inward or outward, right? At a particular price is the quantity demanded getting smaller or larger. So here, if the demand shifts out, if there's an increase in demand, then you get a new equilibrium that corresponds to a higher price and a larger quantity. So all I have to do is think this is why we did all the work on developing the intuition for what curve would shift and in which direction, so that you can predict the new equilibrium, right? And what happens in this case, price goes up and equilibrium quantity increases as well. That was if something caused demand to increase. Now, something could cause demand to decrease. Golf could become less popular, or fashion could change and people wear, instead of the traditional polo, like a wicking fabric, made into a nice neat polo, people start wearing something else, right? Maybe fashion changes and people start golfing in I don't know, muscle shirts, right? Something else, something totally seems unlikely, but something totally different. If that causes the demand for golf shirts to decrease, then you'd be looking at, right, a new equilibrium down here with a lower price and a lower equilibrium quantity. Right, so demand could shift either way. You can have shifts in supply. So let's look at the market for beach umbrellas. Right, there's some demand for them. There's some supply of them. And then there's some equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity. What if a worldwide pandemic causes the production to cease, for a period of time, and then production to be slow, and for some of the inputs to be, delayed, and so ultimately there is a decrease in supply, right? And a decrease, remember, is a leftward shift. Do not say decrease, the supply goes down, and then draw it underneath the existing supply curve. No, right? A decrease in supply means at the particular price, the quantity supplied is now smaller than it is before. This will get you in trouble if you just shift it literally down the page. A decrease in supply is a leftward or inward shift. So if supply decreases, that gives you a new equilibrium with a higher price, but a smaller quantity. And of course, we could do an example where the supply shifts to the right. Those are all your basic examples. And then what happens if a couple things shift at the same time? Well, you just have to shift both of them and then look at the end result. So here's the equilibrium. We need to talk about some particular market. What about the market for sweaters? And if you're looking at the market for sweaters, and what happens if sweaters become more popular? You're like, all right, sweaters are more popular, so that's an increase in demand, right, for sweaters. But at the same time, the materials, the cotton and the wool and the materials that go into making the sweaters become more expensive. And so if input prices go up, then you know that the supply will decrease. And so the combination of both of those gives you a new equilibrium up here. And how does that compare to our initial starting point? I should have labeled this too. Here's the initial equilibrium. Here's the initial price in equilibrium. And so now, after both of these shifts, price has gone up, and equilibrium quantity has gone up a little bit. So you just have to draw both of them and see what happens. Some people present this as a table and say if demand increases and supply decreases, what happens to equilibrium price and quantity? I have no interest in you developing such a table or memorizing, the contents thereof. I'd rather you just quickly sketch it out or think it out in your head and see. Now, the one thing you have to keep in mind here is that some of these will always move. Sometimes the equilibrium price or equilibrium quantity will always move in a particular direction. Sometimes it will depend on the magnitude of the shifts. So notice when demand increases, that pushes the price up. When supply decreases, that pushes the price up. So when both of those happen, it's not surprising then, right, that the price goes up. Notice that by itself, when demand increases, that increases the quantity, the equilibrium quantity. But when supply decreases, that tends to decrease the equilibrium quantity. And so the net of those could go either way. Now, the way I drew it, there is a small increase in the overall equilibrium quantity, right? Q2 is a little bit bigger than before. But if the decrease in supply, right? So when the supply decreased, if it had decreased more, like if we had drawn this all the way back to here, then notice what would have happened. The price would have gone up, but the quantity would have gone down. It's also possible to imagine a scenario where the magnitude of the demand shift and the supply shift are just right, such that this doesn't change at all. So in this case, price goes up, but the equilibrium quantity could go up, could go down, or could stay the same. It all depends on the magnitude of your shifts. So I don't want you to get too stressed about that, but I do want you to worry. No, I'm sorry, I don't want you to worry, but I do want you to be aware. That's the word I was looking for. I do want you to be aware, because sometimes how much it shifts or in what direction, like in the case of the equilibrium quantity, if you happen to have a demand increase and a supply decrease, it will depend on the magnitude of the shifts. It'll depend on how you drew it, and that's okay. But just recognize that that's different than, in this case, the price. The price, if you have a demand increase and a supply decrease at the same time, the price will always go up, right? No matter how big those shifts are. So there you go. That's it for sort of putting the supply and demand together, thinking about equilibrium, and then thinking about those shifts. I do have a few exercises you can practice the demand and supply shifts. And then I think there's just one last topic to wrap up this.